Hello, I'm Anne Green, and welcome to Building Brand Gravity. I'm a principal here at G&S Business Communications, and I'm so pleased to welcome my guest today to the podcast, Dr. Osei Appiah, who is a professor of communication at The Ohio State University, and I appreciate the branding you're wearing today. Welcome. That's right. It looks good. It looks good. Before we dive in, I just want to share a few of your professional accomplishments, which are frankly really impressive, but I think they're also going to give very important context for the conversation today. So you have to listen to me talk about you for just a minute. You are a renowned communication and race scholar who's written and lectured on the impact of strategic communication messages in media on ethnic minorities and the role that stereotypes play on intergroup interaction. And boy, that's so timely in our culture today, I think, so much so. And you co-edited the book, Advertising and Persuasion in a Diverse World, and published in tons of academic journals, Journal of Communication, Human Communications Research, many more. And what was really interesting to me about your bio, and maybe you can comment on this, is it talked about helping to demonstrate to mainstream journal editors and reviewers and readers about the importance of race and why race matters in the field of communication. And I'm not sure if you just want to comment on that briefly, because I do think that forefronting that question is so important, especially in the field that we are both in our own ways.
That's a great question. Thanks for the introduction. And I also want to thank you for having the opportunity to have a conversation with you today on this podcast. It's an honor to be here, and I'm extremely excited and happy. When I look at my research centers on interracial interaction, identity, stereotypes, and the effects of strategic communication messages on ethnic minorities and ethnic majorities. In my field, there have been times where I felt as though race didn't always matter.
Yeah.
I would submit research papers to journals, and editors or reviewers, for example, when I submitted research papers to journals, oftentimes the population that I talked about in those research papers were specific to Blacks, and which I thought is particularly important. But I would oftentimes get reviewers who would comment and say, hey, your research is interesting, but can you provide a comparison group? Can you include white populations in your research, because audiences would be particularly interested to know how whites compare with Blacks. And to me, it somewhat dilutes the importance of looking specifically at the Black community. In order to publish my research, I often felt like I had to incorporate whites into that research in order for it to be seen as significant and important. Today, for example, we're talking primarily about kind of the impact, the empowering and cultivating Black talent. And it's not necessarily that we have in this conversation and we have to talk about white talent alongside of Black talent, but I felt in my research, in order for me to demonstrate the importance of my work, I had to oftentimes use a white comparison group. So that makes it particularly challenging to publish in mainstream journals where you have readers who are overwhelmingly white. So how do you make race important, interesting to audiences who are primarily part of a racial outgroup, which are white? So how do I make talking about Blacks important to white mainstream audiences? So that was the challenge.
That's really helpful, and it puts such good context from the very beginning of this conversation about these moments of centering whiteness that are not even on the radar of many people. You know, that we talk about dominant identities, marginalized identities, and a lot of times those are acting in ways that are subconscious for folks, I think. And what you're saying is really like, well, we have to center whiteness in this, otherwise how will it be relevant? So I agree. Let's recenter this conversation on Black professionals in this industry, and let's be really intentional about that. And one of the things we're going to talk about today And I'll get to it in a minute. I have another lead in because there's some stats I want to share with you that are going to be very familiar to you, and I'd love to
Mhm.
get your take on them to set the stage. But we are going to be talking about a group that you also formed at the Ohio State University called BASCA, the Black Advertising and Strategic Communications Association. And I'm so excited because in a follow-up teaser to this
Mhm.
podcast, I'm going to get to talk to some of the BASCA students. But to back up a little bit, you wrote a paper, and I've got it here. I am a frustrated academic, which I told
Mhm.
you, Osei. You know, I had thought I'd be a professor, so I love talking to those in your
Mhm.
field. But you wrote a paper in 2016 that was published in the Journal of Advertising Education, and the title is fun. Some may recognize the reference here:
Mhm.
Advertising Industry Diversity. We've kind of come a long way, baby.
Right,
But
right.
larger pipeline and more intentional action from industry and educators needed. And in the very beginning, you quoted from the Madison Avenue Project some stats. This is from 2011, that at that time, Black individuals represented 13% of the US population, but made up only 5% of the advertising profession.
Mhm.
So, our amazing digital team here at GNS helped me out and did some research and found the Association of National Advertisers, shout out to my former client,
Mhm.
and the Alliance for Inclusive and Multicultural Marketing just published a study last November, and their stats were that Black individuals make up 12.1% of the US population, so
Mhm.
versus 13, but now are 7.2% of job roles in advertising. So a couple of things. We've gone from 5% to 7.2% between 2011 and 2022.
Mhm.
Progress, but small. And the other thing I would like to say is I recognize that's looking primarily at advertising.
Mhm.
My field is a little bit broader lens of marketing communications, but I feel it's very, very comparable. I would feel the
Mhm.
numbers are we've been a member of the PR Council, and I think that'd
Mhm.
be very similar. But what's just to start off, I assume these numbers are not surprising to you.
Mhm.
I mean, what is your take on this progress, evolution, slow, fast? I mean, what's your reaction to hearing those two bookended together?
Well, a number of things come to mind. First, there's a pressing need. Part of the reason that we're here, you and I are speaking, is that there's a pressing need for companies in partnership with academic institutions to rectify the underrepresentation of Blacks at marketing communication firms. And although society has become increasingly more ethnically diverse, the marketing communication industry, in my opinion, has woefully trailed behind in their efforts to diversify the workplace. Advertising agencies and other marketing communication firms have, in my opinion, have made little progress in hiring Blacks. This is particularly troubling to me, given that, as I kind of alluded to in some of that research from my 2016 paper, that this problem was really identified, about 40 years ago by the New York Human Rights Commission, who actually threatened to force executives at leading ad agencies to testify about their dismal record of hiring ethnic minorities, to really come up and explain, hey, why is this the case? What's the problem? How has this how has this occurred? So, given the historical and current dearth of Blacks at marketing communication agencies, there was a dire need to create a program that could help to address this problem. Maybe shifting a little bit in terms of kind of why I started the Black Advertising Strategic Communication Association. Because of this long history of underrepresentation of Blacks in the marketing communication um, uh, field, if you will. So I know that agencies seek talent with strong educational backgrounds. They want young people to have relevant professional experience and a broad understanding of the industry. And in many ways, that's what we're trying to do with BOSC. I created the Black Advertising Strategic Communication Association it wasn't about, it was 10 years ago. In fact, we just recently celebrated our 10th year
Happy
anniversary.
anniversary. That's
Thank you very
amazing.
much.
It's a big
I appreciate
milestone. Yeah.
it. And what BOSCA aims to do is to lead more Black students to aspire to and attain careers in advertising, PR, marketing, and other strategic communication related occupations. Um, Bosca also provides students with access to professional mentors, create opportunities for students to gain professional experience through internships. Despite our limited funding, we've been able to, over the last 10 years, take Bosca, take our Bosca members, uh, roughly over 100 of them, on annual professional development and career networking trips to major cities like New York, Chicago, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., to meet industry professionals and at these organizations. And we've gone not only to all these cities, we visited a number of companies such as on the way, Coca-Cola, the NFL, CNN, Headline News, Ketchum, Edelman, BBDO, Ogilvy and Mather, Chicago Tribune, Leo Burnett, Burrell Communications, and uh, places like Spotify, Showtime, and of course, one of our favorite places was GNS Communications. So while we were in New York, we were at the good fortune to come to your company and visit. We had a remarkable time. I should also mention, if I may, that we've also made an imprint here locally. Bosca has been able to build relationships with industry leaders here in the greater Columbus area. And many of the industry leaders at companies in the greater Columbus area has helped Bosca to engage our members in internship opportunities, resume workshops, life skills. And in addition to that, we have meetings every twice a month, and we bring in executives from all over the area here. Bosca, in my opinion, has helped Black students acquire knowledge, necessary skills, and experience, thereby generating a pool of top graduates from which local and national agencies can choose. And in that paper, that 2016 paper, I discuss some of the, for lack of a better word, excuses that companies have used to explain the underrepresentation of ethnic minorities, in particular Blacks, at these companies. And what we hear is that although agencies express that they want to hire more ethnic minorities, many claim they cannot find diverse
Oh,
candidates.
yes. That's been a long time trope that I've heard
And,
over the years.
and my argument is, well, now they can, because
Yes.
Bosca is helping to add to that pipeline. So,
You know, the pipeline piece, and I want to talk about the pipeline because you've helped me deepen my thoughts about it in reading your work and talking with you. Because this is something I've reflected on for a very long time. You know, my background as an undergrad, I was a liberal arts person. So I didn't come out of a communications background. So I'm sort of an accidental business person, accidental communications executive. But I did encounter in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was an English major and a women's studies minor. And I think I
mhm,
mentioned this to you when we spoke that that was the first time that I realized as a women's studies person who really was committed to the concept of feminism, I really ran right up against an immediate and necessary and just life changing critique by authors like Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks, who made it very clear to me that feminism centered on whiteness
mhm,
could be a social justice movement that was also oppressive
mhm,
and replicating racism and systemic oppression. To get back to the pipeline, you know, I've had a lot of angst as an executive in this field, and I should, about this whole claim of we can't find the talent. Where is the
mhm,
talent? And that
mhm,
sort of sense of throwing your hands up in helplessness. And I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And obviously, Bosca is one answer. But the other side of it that you brought up to me in your paper is the academy and the education side and what it is educational institutions need to do.
mhm.
Do you want to talk about either of those to mention those two sides of the coin?
Well, I think it's a partnership. And what I mean by partnership, I think it's a partnership between academic institutions and industry. that we need to work together to develop and nurture, as you mentioned, cultivate and empower Black talent. The Academy has a responsibility on their side to increase the interest in the number of majors in strategic communication uh, related areas. What that means is active recruiting and retaining students in those strategic communication related majors. It also means providing a atmosphere and environment that is conducive for those students to succeed, to have a sense of belonging, um, um, and certain things, specific things that we can do is there should be student organizations within the academy. Let's say a school of communication should have student organizations that are geared towards ethnic minorities and other affinity groups, if you will. But in this case, we're talking specifically about Blacks. Should have a Black student organization that deals primarily with issues related to the industry, or I should say, that is focused on professional development, like Bosca. Other things that can be done is having a diversity or DEI committee within the School of Communication, because a DEI committee or some kind of chief diversity officer within the school, within the department, who can have as their job to embrace diversity, to focus on issues of retention, recruitment, um, and also whose responsibility it is to engage in connecting with students. So student organizations, DEI committee. It is also important for, I believe, for in academic institutions to reach out to high schools. And a lot of students, when I was growing up, I didn't know anything about advertising and I didn't know anything about public relations. As a kid growing up in Long Beach, California, in a very indigent, poverty-stricken, gang-infested environment, my what I focused on primarily was sports and playing basketball. Um, Academics was very important in my household. My mom and dad valued academics, but because we had no money, the way in which I felt I needed to get out of that environment and go to college was through sports. So I played basketball, got a scholarship to play basketball at Santa Clara University. I apologize, I didn't really go over my educational background, but it wasn't until I got to college, in fact, to graduate school when I was working on my Ph.D., that I really learned anything about advertising. I was getting my Ph.D. at Stanford University, and I saw that there were some flyers across campus that talked about uh, a chairman and CEO from an advertising agency was coming to speak at Stanford. In fact, his name is Joe Muse. He was the chairman and CEO of Muse, what at the time was Muse, Cadero, and Chin, that
Mm-hmm.
ultimately turned into Muse Communications. And again, I'm a PhD student. I'm probably, I don't know, 25, 26 years old. And I went to go watch him. I went to go listen to his presentation. And he talked about his business. He talked about why he started Muse Cadero and Chan, or Muse Communications, um, which was a multicultural advertising agency. And there weren't a whole lot of them. I mean, we had Burrell Communications, which has been the standard historically, but there weren't many of those. And as I listened to him and heard him talk about how much joy, how much passion he had for advertising and the industry, and as he talked about what advertising was and what it did, it fascinated me. So this was really the first time I was able to hear about advertising, and this was coming from a Black man, chairman, CEO of an ad agency, and he was Black. So at 25, this is kind of my first introduction to advertising outside of watching television. I'm looking at a guy who worked in the industry. And at that point, I immediately said, you know what? This is an area that is open, available, and accessible to me because I see someone who looks like me who's doing it. So I say that in the context of when you go to high schools, the academy, or industry professionals, and you talk to kids about what you do, it informs them not only about the industry, but they not only do they get to know about it, they can start aspiring to careers or occupations that are that they hear about, that they see people who look like them. So I think it's important for industry professionals and the academy to go into high schools and talk about advertising to get young people informed about it and to start aspiring to those careers. I think it's particularly important to have scholarships within these schools that are specific to diverse groups, and not only specific to diverse groups, rewarding and acknowledging ethnic minorities, in particular Blacks, who are excelling academically in those areas. And that's particularly important to acknowledge and to provide um, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of reward for those students who are doing well, because it lets them know that they can continue on in that field and it's a rewarding one. So, and the last thing, and I'm sorry to be so long winded,
Oh, not at all.
it's important to provide mentors for young people to work with academic institutions as industry professionals, to work with young people who are aspiring to get into Marcom areas and mentor them, help to advise them on the right path, the right journey, let them know what pitfalls they may face and various challenges, but also help them understand the benefits of getting into those fields and that um, the field is welcoming.
This is part of the larger challenge and healing of our society. And how do we understand each people as a whole? And how do we look in the face of our history
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, the biases we carry? I mean, it goes so deep and broad. And my field in literature is actually American literature in the 1800s, which is really a fraught time, obviously. And it's the Manifest Destiny, Fugitive Slave Act, Civil War. I mean, it's really America trying to fight for what it thought its identity would be, you know, coming from the Puritan era, even. I mean, this is anybody who hit me up if you want to talk about these things, like how did America's culture become it? But I think one of the things that at GNS, it is a journey, and there's one of the things I try to fight against, and it's something actually I think will be a big theme of mine and other leadership this year, is trying to kind of erase zero sum thinking. And what I mean by that is that multiple things can be true at one time. We can, as GNS, be making and have made real progress, and we can also be not there yet, and also not be great in other areas. You know, there can still be microaggressions or cultural issues or things that we need to work out together.
Mm-hmm.
So I really believe that. And one of the areas, and I want to talk about this question of representation, you know, one of the things that we know we need to work on over time is representation at the highest levels of our agency, the owner group, the senior leadership. And we're really trying to take steps to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's always that phrase, representation matters.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in the dialogue out in the world today, there's other counterpoints to that, or they're not even counterpoints, but there are other threads like diversity isn't enough. We need to get to equity. We need to get to belonging. We need to get to a real sense of inclusion. We need to get to justice. Or, you know, we don't want to be in the early days. And this is where all of these debates around affirmative action come in, which get very ugly and are very timely right now. But, you know, what is it about numbers? But what you're saying, and I'd love you to reflect on it more, is that I do feel representation does matter, to see yourself in leadership, to see that it's possible. You know, when you talk to your students, how do you think they reflect on seeing pathways through other human beings that share their experience or look like them or are part of a shared identity? How does that affect them, do you think?
Well, you mentioned a host of things,
Yeah.
and maybe I'll tackle the student aspect
Yeah.
last. Let me maybe focus on the industry part of what you were saying first, if I may. Um, Let me first say some things that, let me elaborate on some things that companies can do when we think about kind of representation. How do we get representation? First and foremost, we, or industries, partners, need to hire more people of color, in particular blacks. That starts off first and foremost with hiring folks who have experience. Oftentimes, no one's going to get hired unless they have some experience. How do you get experience? You can't get experience unless you
Yeah.
get hired. That happens with internships, and I know that um, internships for students are particularly valuable so that they can gain that experience and hopefully
Mhm.
gain a job within a company. But so let's think about some things in terms of what companies can do. One, they can offer mentorship programs, which is something that I talked about before, because mentorship and guidance can help students go down the right path and develop experience, knowledge that's particularly important to be marketable. Two, companies can advocate for diverse candidates. And I think you and I have had conversations before, such that if there are people of color who work at the company, especially blacks, it's important to not only have mentorship, but to have folks in the company who advocate for folks of color. Oftentimes, I think this is unfortunate, but in many cases, it's important to have, as a black person, to have allies who don't look like you,
Mhm.
who can advocate for you, because in many cases, their comments, their advocacy in many ways matters more. It holds more credibility among white mainstream employees and managers. Um, and so that's very important to have advocates who look like you and who don't look like you. Also, it's important to create a workplace that embraces diversity. I mentioned some of the things that GNS is doing in terms of things like having affinity groups, having a DEI committee, and I think you have GNS has both of
Mhm.
those. Um, this is an important one and maybe somewhat controversial in some circles, but promotions should, in part, be tied to the development of diverse talent.
Mm.
We
Mhm.
speak a lot about, okay, oh, we have a committee that's doing this, or we had a workshop on this, or we've spoken to our black professionals in our company, but how are we holding each other accountable? If we really embrace diversity, if it's really important, then maybe part of our, as managers, as supervisors, maybe part of our promotions, our raises should be tied, again, in part to how we're developing talent. How are we leading? So I think that's particularly important.
I love, just to jump on that really quickly, not to take you off track, but I think it's so important because it is that question of accountability, and that's what's been missing. Now, again, the New York City Human Rights Commission tried to create
Right,
some
right,
years ago, but
right.
this question of how do you embed it in your values, but then how do you make that real, and what are the KPIs or the
Mhm,
key performance indicators for each
mhm,
person as they go. And we do have our task force, and we're actually even examining, like, should we still call it a task force? Is it
mhm,
how do we look at an ongoing body? We haven't formed formal affinity groups yet, but many other methods of conversation. But I think that question of how do we, and we're in our performance review cycle
mhm,
right now as I talk
mhm.
to you today, it's like, how do we lean into helping managers at all levels understand what it actually means to incorporate the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a
Mhm,
champion, as
mhm,
advocate? Because one of the observations that I have, but it's like not surprising, I mean, it's something we've talked about, is that bringing talented individuals in from marginalized communities, especially from the Black community, because of the unique history of the United States
Mhm.
and the unique challenges that we face in this area, to say the least, so deep in the DNA of this country. It's one thing to bring folks in, but it's another to help them feel that they want to stay.
When you say see it here or see it when I go
Just
and
as you
visit,
look out in the world and watch the industry. Yeah.
um, this couple things come to mind.
Yeah.
One is, in society in general, and I'll probably talk a little bit about my research. What we're seeing in society, whether we're watching the news, um, especially when we look at the news media, much of the popular press and even some academic literature point to a bleak picture for the future of race relations. We see so much divisiveness um, out in the world, at least as it's communicated to us through media. But in my opinion, I think the negativity, the divisiveness, the racial tension that we hear is in many ways overstated.
Mhm.
The reason I say it's overstated, and we have a tendency to focus on negativity, at least from a media standpoint. I'm encouraged because I see young people who are engaged, who have cross interracial friendships.
Mhm.
I see uh, middle school kids and high school kids who are interacting with other diverse groups on a regular basis. When I walk across campus, I see black students and white students sitting down, having lunch together, talking about exams and homework. I see much more interracial interaction, and although it's the BOSCA is the Black Advertising Strategic Communication Association. There are a number of um, diverse students who are part of our organization, whether they're Black, white, Hispanic. So I guess what I'm saying here is that I'm encouraged because there's
Mhm.
a lot more focus, one from academics and many industry folks, in being intentional about creating environments that are conducive for people of color to succeed in. I'm encouraged because young people are much more progressive in their thinking, and it's much more commonplace for them to interact with one another, and they're much more open-minded and less closed-minded. They don't see, in many cases, and my research kind of points to this, they don't. A white person doesn't necessarily, among young people, don't necessarily see blacks as out groups. They often see blacks as in-group members because we look at race and we want to say that, oh, because someone is white and someone is black, they're out groups. But whites, for example, don't always use race as a way of determining similarity or commonality. They oftentimes use things like social class cues or occupational cues to determine if one is similar to another. So the reason that out-group and in-group aspects are important, because when you start looking at someone as being different, someone who is an out-group, you engage in biases and prejudices. So, um, in my long-winded way of speaking, I'm encouraged because I don't see as much of that going on. And if I may, can I comment about, again,
Mhm.
some things I think that are important for
Yes,
companies
please.
to do? Um, I believe we talked about representation, and I think that's fantastic. When I walk across, when I'm in my office here in the School of Communication at The Ohio State University, and we have 4 Black faculty members. Um, in my program. Okay, that's great. I walk around, I'm like, oh, there's my guy, Dr. Linear Holt, and there's my
Hmm.
good friend Dr. Felicia Ross. And it does make me feel good and make me feel a lot more comfortable with that representation. But one thing that's particularly important, you ask about, what can we do or how can employees um, feel more comfortable in essence? Well, I think one of those things is we need to engage in more cross group communication.
Hmm.
I think when you're an ethnic minority, you clearly in many ways find yourself accommodating, being accommodating to that mainstream culture, and you have to communicate with your white mainstream colleagues. But that isn't necessarily the case for whites. And what I mean by cross group communication
Hmm.
is that we need to be intentional on making sure that when we're at the office, that we, not blacks, but we
Yeah.
being white folks,
Yeah.
aren't
Everybody.
indirectly segregating themselves from people of color by not engaging in some level of communication, by not creating a culture that embraces difference and diversity. So we need to be intentional by engaging in literally having conversations with people who look different from you. So whites having conversations with blacks, irrespective of what level you are, because
Yeah.
cross group communication leads to mutual understanding.
Hmm.
It leads to meaningful cross group interaction. It reduces racial prejudice. It creates interpersonal relationships and friendships. And there's something that I call the ABCs of um, understanding key communication processes. And this is particularly important, I think, for corporate America. The ABCs are there needs to be awareness. And what I mean by awareness is be aware of the psychological mechanisms that impact our thoughts about interactions with one another. What that means is when we come across someone, we tend to immediately make similarity
Hmm.
judgments. We make similarity judgments based on how people look. They're superficial, but if I'm a white person, I see another white person, that person is similar to me, I begin to think that that person is part of my in group. When I see someone who doesn't look like me, I kind of see them as an out group, and that can be manifested in biases,
Hmm.
even though it may not be, even though it may be implicit, there can be biases that causes you to not interact with someone who is different. So we
Yeah.
need to be intentional about looking and interacting, having conversations with people who look different from us outside of our first impressions of making these kind of surface and long lasting uh, uh, impressions that are oftentimes based on superficiality. B, so there's A, awareness, there's B, we need to banish bias.
Love it.
And what I mean by that is minimize or banish cross group bias. That means how do we do that? We engage in perspective taking of someone who is
Hmm.
different from
Yeah.
us. We engage in intergroup contact. That means literally going and, as I said before, having communication, having conversations with someone who is different. What's interesting is people generally overestimate the existence of differences between their own group and those of other groups, even rival out groups. So we tend to overestimate, differences, for example, that blacks have with whites or whites have with blacks. So we have to be intentional about banishing bias, be aware of our implicit biases, and try our hardest to be aware of that and to respond to it. And the last thing, which is C, create connections.
Mm.
Recognize the power to make positive and meaningful connections between groups. Take more time to make meaningful uh, connections. Um, we need more intentionality. Look beyond, as I kind of alluded to before, look beyond the surface characteristics of others. So, A, awareness, B, banish the bias, and 3, create connections.
This is an amazing way. I mean, first of all, I am so heartened by your very research and data based view of, as well as qualitative, of being encouraged, because I do feel that way as well. And I think my big message for everyone is that embrace, and really with an open heart, the fact that you can be making progress and also not be there yet. And that's okay. And that's really, our industry has been as a whole very defensive. And sometimes I hear this thing of, well, we're doing everything we can. It's like, no, let's hold it more loosely. And let's be open hearted about, we're making progress. Look at it, but it's not good enough yet. Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
But I love ending with the ABCs. And just before we sign off today, and thank you for all your time. I mean, I love every time we talk, but is there any particular book or reference or website that you might want our listeners to check out, just that you think could be helpful to them?
Ooh, that's
Putting you on the spot here.
oh man. Um,
I mean, some of them I know that we've read as a group is The Sum of Us, which was
mhm.
really helpful to understand sort of the underlying currents of American society. Also, Bias by Jennifer Eberhardt. I know that was one that
I
was
think
helpful to
I,
me.
I was thinking of that same book.
Oh,
That's
okay.
the first one that comes to mind because I
Yeah.
think we need to be aware of the implicit biases that we have and how
Yeah.
that can manifest itself in our attitudes and behaviors. So
Yeah.
that actually was going to be the book I would recommend, um, both because it gives us real understanding of this implicit biases. It gives us real research, it provides us research evidence of how these things really happen. That it isn't just in the
Mm.
imagination. People have biases. Everyone has them. I have
Yeah.
them. You have them. But
Yep.
it's important to be aware of those. So that would be a book. That would be the book that comes to mind.
Yeah, so that's Biased. Everybody can Google it. But Dr. Osei Appiah, Ohio State University, The Ohio State University, thank you again so much for being with us today. And everyone can look for the follow up episode where I get to talk to three of the students from the executive board of BOSCA. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed our conversation and feel honored to be here.